Hi, my name is Johnny Pollock and I'm the pastor of Calvary Church Loughrea. And over the past few weeks, we've been going through the Word One-to-One as we've been taking a step-by-step approach through the Gospel of John, especially tailored for those who have maybe never read the Bible before or want to study the Bible in a really simple way. Many times the Bible and its history and its context and a lot of different trappings of religion have made it that we are panicked about reading the Bible. And yet it's a wonderful book. It's a very simple book to understand, a very challenging book once we realise what it holds, but it gives us a chance to understand who Jesus is and why this matters. If you want to look back at some of the other videos we have done, please click the link below and you'll be able to access them. But here's the copyright information for the Word One-to-One from the word121.com, where you can get the link below to the PDFs that we've been looking at, or even just watch them on the screen. And then again, 10ofthose.com that are the publishers and have some amazing and great helpful resources for Bible study and understanding more about God. So today we're in session 34 and we're really getting into the crux of the death and resurrection of Jesus as we enter into chapter 18 and look at verses 1 to 27 of the betrayal and arrest of Jesus. In chapters 11 and 12, we saw the resurrection of Lazarus and then heard Jesus' explanation of his death. Jesus said that he is the resurrection and the life, and that the life that he came to bring would come through the death and resurrection. The public events of Jesus' life and death were then interrupted by his private instruction for his disciples, which is chapter 13 to 17. And he was explaining what this life was to be like for them. And now, after explaining about life, death, and resurrection, we're going to return to the public events of Jesus' death and his life after. There are two parts to today's section. Verses 1 to 11 are part 1, which is a planned death, and then part 2, verses 12 to 27, death in our place. And it's all about the life from God which comes through Jesus' death and resurrection. So, chapter 18, beginning in verse 1. It says, when he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with him. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." And then as we go into verse 10 and 11, it says, then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Verse 10 is interesting here. The servant's name was Malchus. The detail John gives us in naming Malchus is if he were saying, look, go and check what I'm writing. Presumably Malchus, or at least his relatives, would have still been alive and could confirm what John was saying. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a made-up story. It uses real times, real places, and real people so that these facts, this evidence can be evaluated. But from verse 1 to 11, what are the different pointers that Jesus is in total control of the journey to his death? Verses 1 and 2, he chose where to go. Verse 4, he hands himself over. Verse 5, he identifies himself with the authority of the name of God. He says, "I am," again, multiple times through John's gospel that he said this. He is all-powerful, even when faced with armed soldiers in verse 6. Verse 7, he refuses to escape. Verse 8, he controls who the soldiers let go. And then verse 9, he fulfills his promise. So throughout the whole encounter, he leads the conversation. Verse 4, Jesus went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" Verse 7 again, "Who is it that you want?" And then verse 11, Jesus commanded Peter to put your sword away. So the entire incident is one which Jesus shows absolute control. His arrest is not an accident, but is actually part of his plan. He is in complete control over all the events that are happening. He could stop them, but these are so it would be fulfilled that he would die as a substitute for sin. Now, if we look at the next slide, we're going to see the answers to some of those questions as we have maybe had as we went through verses 1 to 11. So who do they say they're looking for? Jesus of Nazareth. What special name does Jesus use to describe himself? He says, I am he. Now, as we've noticed all the way through John's Gospel, I am is God's name for himself. Jesus is saying, I am God. What happens when Jesus says, I am he? Well, they literally fall to the ground in verse 6. Just imagine that you're one of the officials. You turn up with a whole detachment of soldiers, armed to the teeth, ready to arrest just one armed man, and he simply speaks and you're blown off your feet. You have to pick yourself up and then pretend that you're still in control. But I suppose, why does Jesus want to go to his death? He tells us in verse 11 that he's clear that he must die and drink the cup that the Father has given. Now, when he speaks of this cup, we need to understand what it means, and it's actually first mentioned in the Old Testament. In the book of Isaiah, the cup is God's wrath, God's anger, the judgment the people deserve, which God himself takes from them. Isaiah 51 verse 22 said, See, I have taken out of your hand the cup that has made you stagger. From that cup, the goblet of my wrath, you will never drink again. Now, salvation, that means rescue, comes through the Messiah, who is Jesus, who takes and drinks the cup of God's judgment that we deserve. He does this as he dies for us on the cross. Before Jesus goes to the cross, he explains his death is planned. He is in absolute control of his death and also the reason for his death. Now, as we know, Jesus doesn't deserve God's wrath, so why does he do this? And I want us to read on in verse 12 and 14. Because as we'll see, it's not just that Jesus is dying, but his death is in our place. It says, Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. So why does John remind us of Caiaphas' words? If you remember all the way back in chapter 11, he said the words that are on the screen. And Caiaphas said that after Lazarus was brought back to life from Jesus, it would be better if one person died. Verse 49 to 53 say, Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. So from that day, they plotted to take his life. So Caiaphas' prophecy was that one man would die on behalf of the people so that the whole nation would be saved. And John wants us to remember this so that we'll understand the reason for Jesus' death. Now, as we continue on in our questions in the next slide, does this mean Jesus is unwilling or reluctant to go to his death? Well, no, because even from the beginning of John's Gospel, this has been his entire mission. It's his will because it's the Father's will. And so as we summarize this, Jesus is following his clear plan. He is in charge as God, the great I am. He wants to do the Father's will. And the judgment of God for sin is the cup. And Jesus takes this cup for us and drinks it himself. His death on the cross is a demonstration of his great love for us. And John 15:13 says this, Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. So is the cross just a great example of Jesus' love? Well, no, because the cross has always been the purpose of Jesus' mission. He came to die. So what does Jesus' death on the cross actually achieve? Well, he was our substitute. He took the punishment of God's judgment that we deserve on himself so that we can be made right with God. Now, theologians call this very fancy term penal substitution. So basically, penal, that he carried the punishment of God's judgment through his death on the cross, and substitution because it was in our place and for our sin. And we'll see this from our next slide in verses 15 to 23. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? She asked Peter. He replied, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood round a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. I have spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in the synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Verse 24 in the next slide. "Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself. So they asked him, 'You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?' He denied it, saying, 'I am not.' One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. 'Didn't I see you with him in the garden?' Again, Peter denied it. At that moment, the cock began to crow." The section we've just read is like a sandwich. The two sections are actually about Peter, which is the bread, and then Jesus in the centre, which is the filling. It shows us that Jesus died in our place as a substitute. Now, what does Peter look like in these two sections? Well, he looks completely weak. He can't even stand up, in a sense, to a servant girl in verse 16 and 17, or even a crowd of servants in verses 25 to 26. And what he does in these two sections is he denies his relationship with Jesus. Now remember who Peter is. He is the lead disciple in John chapter 1, where he is called Cephas, which in Aramaic and Greek means rock. So we expect Peter the rock to be the most committed of the lot. And he sounds totally committed in chapter 13, verse 37, when he says, "Lord, I will lay down my life for you." But what are we learning here? Well, we're being shown that even Peter, the most promising, committed, wholehearted and bold of all the disciples, he fails hopelessly in the most humiliating way in front of a servant girl and a bunch of servants. Now, how are we like Peter? Well, like Peter, we constantly fail Jesus, and we are not spiritually strong enough to stand for Jesus in our own strength. We hate the idea that our sins mean that Jesus needed to die in our place. Now, if we look back again at verses 18 to 25, that we can actually see this basically unfold. It says, "It was cold, and the servants and officials stood round a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself." Verse 25, "Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there, warming himself, so they asked him, 'You are one of his disciples too, are you?' He denied it, saying, 'I am not.'" Now, the story could have easily missed out verses 19 to 24, and we reread verse 18 and then verse 25 again. But why are verses 19 to 24 included? Well, if you look at how different Jesus is from Peter, Jesus stands up to the high priest and the Jewish officers. He remains the true I am, who perfectly and consistently does God's will. And in contrast, Peter can't and doesn't stand up either to a servant girl or to a bunch of servants. Instead, he warms himself by the fire, where his king is deliberately going to his death for Peter. Here then is Jesus the substitute, who perfectly does what you and I fail to do. So if we put the two parts of the notes together, part one, Jesus' death, is all part of his plan. His death was intentional. But part two, Jesus dies in our place, that he was our substitute. Now, I want us to take a moment or two and consider this. Because what does this have to do with you and me? I don't know what your view was of why Jesus died before you started reading through John, and I wonder, has it changed since? And if so, how has it changed? Maybe what was your thought of yourself before you read through John's Gospel? And indeed, has this view changed? And if so, how? And I would love you to let us know how that has happened, or what has happened. But what is Jesus offering to us in today's section of John? Verse 11, "Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Verse 14, "It would be good if one man died for the people." What is Jesus offering? Well, through his death, he is offering forgiveness and a relationship with God, simply in and through him, his sacrifice as a substitute for us. Now, as we look back in verses 1 to 27, we can see the recap of this, and do take time and pause and think about what these verses mean and how the different characters in the story, Jesus, the chief priests and the Pharisees, Judas, Peter, how they all respond about the truth of Jesus, and what that says about us as we think about how we respond to him. Next time, we're going to see how the people respond to Jesus' death, not just his arrest and his condemnation, but his actual death on the cross. And so if you do have any questions, any comments, anything to say, please feel free to get in touch either below the line, or indeed you can privately get in touch with us, and we would love to chat to you more about the Bible, which is God's word, and how it can truly transform our lives. So next time, as I said, we're going to be walking through the next part of John's Gospel as we near to the end. But as for now, may God bless you. Goodbye.